Hi, my name is Tom and today I want to talk to you about a very special camera that's been with me for a very long time. It's the Sony RX10 II, which is actually filming me right now, so I will probably just show you some B-roll of it. And yeah, this video is here to showcase the world that this camera is really good and might even still be relevant for some people in 2023. And yeah, in my opinion, this is one of the most underrated, overlooked cameras ever for filmmakers, especially for beginners. So I put together a reel a while ago with footage exclusively from this camera. So enjoy that, watch it. Maybe this will pique your interest, and after that we'll talk some details. Enjoy. First of all, thank you to Caleb Pike, or DSLR video shooter, for shouting me out in his last video about the smoke filter. That was really cool and really unexpected. So yeah, I gained some subscribers from that. So welcome to everyone who's watching this who came from him. So again, thank you. This was surreal and I really appreciate it. So what first intrigued me as a beginning filmmaker with this camera was that it really was ready out of the box. You buy this thing, you have everything you need. You only need a battery, which is included, and you need to pop in an SD card, and then you're ready to shoot. The lens is already stuck to it, you cannot detach it, and there's an ND filter included even, so an internal ND filter, which is unheard of in most cameras in this form factor. So this was really a selling point for me. You can just buy it, and as a beginner you can start immediately. You don't need to research a lens, you don't need to buy accessories if you don't really want to. This camera is ready to go. It kind of reminds me of the camcorder style camera you could buy back in those days, but those pretty much don't exist anymore. So yeah, I really just like that about it. So here are a few video specs about this camera. It has a 1-inch sensor which can shoot 4K in up to 30 frames. Of course, it can also do 25 frames and 24. It can shoot full HD, 120p slow motion, which will look great and will cut really well with the 4K. You can go crazy high with the slow motion, up to 1000 frames, but at that point the image will degrade a bit. So I just stick with 120. I think you can also do 200, 240 and stuff like that, which will still look good. I mostly stick with 120 at the maximum. And the footage looks really good. The lens it comes with is also great. It's a 24 to 200mm zoom lens with a constant f2.8 aperture, so no matter how far you zoom in, the aperture always stays the same and you don't lose exposure or light, which is a great thing. But what was really the main selling point for me with this camera was that it was also able to shoot S-Log2. Back in those days, if you wanted a camera that can shoot S-Log2, you had to spend a bit of money. And this camera was basically, when it was on sale, the cheapest Sony camera that can shoot log. And yeah, that really intrigued me and was really the main reason why I bought it. It also didn't have some of the problems a lot of Sony cameras had in those days. Like it did have a headphone jack input and a microphone input, which also had good preamps, so they worked really well. There wasn't a lot of noise introduced when using them. It also never overheated, even in 4K or in the slow motion modes, and I used it to this day in sunny weather, in warm rooms and all that. It never overheated on me. I never got any temperature warnings. And we all remember, I think, in like the days of 2015, 2016, and even to this day, some Sony cameras still have major problems with overheating. Like back in those days, the A7S II and the A6400 and 300 and all those cameras with the Super 35 sensor, the full frame sensor, they basically pretty much all overheated at some point. And yeah, this is an issue that still plagues some cameras, even from other brands like Canon. And yeah, this camera, I don't know if it has a fan included or something like that. I mean, it does make a noise when I turn it on, so there's probably a fan in there, and the 1-inch sensor probably also helps because it doesn't take as much processing power. It never overheats, which was a really good thing. Another great thing about this camera is that it also matches really well with other cameras from Sony that are more expensive and more video focused. Like from those days, the FS5, the A7S, all those cameras also shot in S-Log2, so that meant this is a great B cam, and that also means the same LUTs that work for the A7S, the same LUTs that work for the FS5 also worked on this camera. Of course, it's not exactly the same. This camera has a smaller sensor, it has less dynamic range probably, but all in all, the color presets, all the settings basically matched. So this really helped me to find good tutorials and stuff like that and apply them to this camera, because everyone else used a different camera, but the color science is the same. So I could use the same resources, the same lookup tables to get my footage to the next level, learn from it, and yeah, use great lookup tables to make it look cinematic. And again, I want to mention, this camera was much more affordable than the FS5 or even the A7S. It was more in line with the A6300, which also came out kind of in that time frame. But yeah, this was really a cool option because it dropped in price quite quickly and it came with everything. The lens, as I mentioned, is great. It shoots really nice bokeh. The slow motion is great, and yeah, it was kind of a sleeper that nobody noticed, because this camera can do a lot of things that all the other cameras also did. Just there were some compromises that really, especially for beginners, aren't as important. And then what really made me fall in love with this camera was when I started using the fusion filters. And if you know my channel, you know I'm all about that stuff. And this was really the last piece of the puzzle for me to make this camera that was like advertised as like a boring grandpa travel camera. It really transformed it for me into a camera that is relevant for filmmakers. And yeah, after that I really had fun with this thing. And you know, all the videos I shot, most of this was shot on this camera. And when I try something new, when I try a new filter, it always goes first on this camera, because yeah, it's so fun to do. You obviously don't have to use a diffusion filter to get great filmic looking images. You can also do it in post. There are a billion options out there. But for me, this was really the last thing that really made me fall in love with it. And that's also the reason why I shot an entire short film on this camera with the black diffusion filter in combination. And yeah, I already talked about that in another video. I will link the short film here somewhere for you to watch if you want to see how this camera performs in like a narrative short film. And yeah, this short film wasn't like a huge success or cleaned up at every festival. I just want to like show it to you because I'm still kind of proud of it, because this was really a turning point for me where I really fell in love with filmmaking and wanted to continue. So if you want to check it out, I will link it somewhere here. And while shooting this film, this camera also had to take a lot of damage. This camera actually fell down on a big rock, and I was really scared that it was just broken and the short film couldn't be completed. But you can still see where the rock hit, and it kind of left a big mark, and the camera didn't complain. It still kept working. There was also rain, there was sand flying everywhere, and it took a lot of abuse, and it took it like a champ. It never stopped working, and I was able to complete the short film without any problems. So that's also a huge plus for this camera. It's pretty robust in my opinion. But now let's talk about some things that are not so great about this camera, and there are a few. First of all, this is a bridge camera and it has a fixed lens. That means this lens cannot be detached. You cannot exchange it, and that is already quite limiting. As I said, this zoom lens is great. It has a lot of range. It has a constant aperture. It basically can do everything you want if you know its limitations. But if it breaks, if it gets scratched, or if some damage is done to the lens, basically your whole camera is done. So this is something to keep in mind. Maybe a good option would be to use a lens filter anyway. I mean, I use diffusion all the time, and if something gets right in front of the lens or a stone flies directly towards it, yeah, the lens filter will probably break, not the lens. So don't just use lens filters as like aesthetics, use them for protection, because this camera is just a all-in-one package. If the lens breaks, the camera is pretty much useless. So that is something to keep in mind. Another obvious con with this camera is that it's not great in low light, which is to be expected. This is a 1-inch sensor. It's not a full frame camera like the A7S, so it will not let in a lot of light, but it's still usable at higher ISOs. I wouldn't go above a certain range, like everything over 2000 ISO can get problematic, but you can still use it. It's no problem. I used it a ton in some projects, and basically nobody ever complains. It depends on what you're doing. If you're shooting like a long scene and you go constantly above the recommended ISO range, yeah, it can degrade the footage. But if you shoot something, what I do, like music videos with fast cuts and stuff like that, nobody's going to notice if you have the wrong ISO or the noise is a bit too much. You can always clean it up in post. Some of my best footage was shot on very high ISO on this camera, and yeah, it still looks great. The noisy footage still has some character to it. Of course, it loses some sharpness, and yeah, it can escalate very quickly, but you just have to know its limitations and how to work around them. And other than that, I think it's still very capable even in low light. And obviously, if you shoot something that you want to look very good, you probably use lights anyway. So just keep the limitations in mind. It's not a low light camera, it will not see in the dark, but it can still shoot great footage even in low light. And now that I mentioned the small sensor, that also means it's not as easy to get the shallow depth of field that you want, especially as a beginning filmmaker, because that's all you think about. You want the bokeh in the background, and you basically only want the tip of the nose to be in focus, and everything else needs to look creamy and out of focus and dreamlike. And obviously, once you progress as a filmmaker, you learn that's not always needed. And even if you want it with this camera, it's still possible, because you can zoom in a lot, and that's basically what you have to do. You have to get a few steps back from the actor and then zoom in a bit, and then of course your focal range changes, so this is also something to keep in mind. But you can get very shallow depth of field with this camera as long as you have enough space to move back a little bit. And yeah, it's not like with a full frame camera where you can use a high aperture and still get very shallow depth of field because it's a huge sensor. This crops in a lot, so keep that in mind. You can still do it, not in all cases, but in most cases you will find a way to get your shallow depth of field. As I mentioned before, this camera avoids some of the problems Sony cameras had in those days, but some of it obviously can't avoid. And the first thing is the battery life. The battery life is not great. It will last you maybe around 50 minutes, so not even an hour if you shoot 4K. I don't know, in other modes maybe it can take a little longer, but if you only shoot with a battery, you have to exchange it quite fast. There are ways around that though. You can charge the battery while shooting, so you can just put on a power bank, plug it into the micro USB port and charge the battery while filming, and that can basically extend your battery life to infinity. And that's what I do a lot, and the micro USB connector is quite stable, and even if it gets ripped off, it doesn't matter, you can put it back in. The camera doesn't shut off because it's not powering the camera, it's powering the battery that will already have a bit of charge anyway. So this is a way to get around that problem. So to me, it's not that big of a deal. Then there's also the menu system. And yeah, the menu system is not great. It's actually kind of mind-blowing how bad it is compared to the competition and compared to manufacturers like Blackmagic. It really is insanely confusing, but luckily there's tons of resources out there, lots of tutorials for cameras like the A7S, how to set it up and how to use the function buttons and how to put presets on certain buttons. And the menu system is basically the exact same on the RX10, so you can apply those settings to this camera. And yeah, it will take you a day to get used to it and put every function button where you want it to, and after that you will be able to use this camera without many problems. I have to admit there are still some settings in this camera that I don't understand, and just ignore them and use the camera. I'm at a point where I can use this camera with my eyes closed basically, but it took a while and it shouldn't take this long, and Sony really was bad with menus, and they're still not the greatest, but they improved a bit on that front. But yeah, on this camera the menu is not great, so make sure to set it up and then you can get going. Some other small cons that aren't a big deal in my opinion is the manual focusing is electronic, so there isn't like a focus point where you can always trust if I turn it that way the focus will shift that way. No, it depends on how fast you move the ring, how slow you move the ring, and then the focus will never be at the exact same point. It takes some getting used to. I pretty much just use the autofocus, and then when I have the thing in focus that I want, I turn to manual focus and the camera stays locked in where it is. And if I have to adjust, I can still do it manually. It's not a big deal. You have great peaking functions and stuff like that to help you with focusing. So to me, that's not a big issue. It's annoying and it shouldn't be the way it is, but you can work around it. Then I just mentioned the autofocus. It's obviously not as great as modern Sony cameras. It's not the face detection that you have on other cameras these days, but it still works okay. I think it's still better than the one the GH cameras from Panasonic have. But yeah, it will do the job. It's doing its job right now, I hope. And you might see some pulsating in the background, but it's very minimal. So you can even use it for stuff like this that I'm doing right now. Just filming yourself, put it on autofocus, and it will, as you can see, maybe not, I have no idea, we'll check later, keep your face in focus. So that still works, but it's not as great as modern cameras. And that's pretty much it for this video. I really wanted to make a video about this camera one day, and yeah, today is the day, I guess, where I will finally finish up the video and then upload it to YouTube, because I really want people to know that this camera was special to me and that it could have been much more successful, I think, if Sony did something else with the marketing, because they basically marketed this camera as like the travel camera for grandpa, and it really is capable of much more than that. And it should have really been sold as like a competitor to the pocket cinema camera, like the first pocket cinema camera, because they have similar sensors, of course, way different features and a bit of a different mindset with those cameras, but this really could have been like a first-time filmmaker kit for beginners. It really could have been sold that way, and it probably would have made a lot of people happy that bought some other cameras that were too much for those people. So it's really kind of a shame that this camera was marketed the way it was, and it also started with a kind of a too high of a price point, and then dropped really quickly, but then people forgot about it because then other cameras came around, and yeah, it didn't work great. For me, this was the sweet spot for beginning filmmakers, for starting out. It had 4K, it had great HD, it had S-Log, it had so many things going for it. Of course, the sensor is very small, you have a fixed lens, which is not always what you want, but again, for someone who's starting out, even today, I think this is a good option, and you can get it for very cheap these days on eBay for like, I don't know, 500, 600 bucks. And for that price, I would go for it, because this camera still has a lot to offer, still makes great images, and yeah, I'm just very happy with it, and I'm never gonna sell mine. So yeah, that's it for this video. I just wanted to tell you about it, and hopefully I could really bring that to you, how much I like this camera. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and yeah, I'm gonna make a new video someday. I don't know when, but stay subscribed, stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.